My name is Michael McFall. For those of you who don't know, I'm the director of the Freeman Spogli Institute. And this is our second in a series of seminars that we're doing collectively at FSI called COVID and. Today's host, last week, for those of you who didn't join us, we had our group from Stanford Health Policy lead a discussion. And today we're going to turn it over to CDDRL. And note that next week, same time, same place, CSAC will be hosting our seminar. So Didi Kuo, the Associate Director for Research, I think is going to moderate this session. And with that, I'll turn it over to Didi.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in today. We hope wherever you are, you're, of course, safe and healthy. I'll introduce our speakers very briefly before they each speak for about 8 minutes, 10 minutes tops, and then please type any questions you have into the Q&A, and we'll get to them after we've heard from all 4 of our speakers. We're going to start with Larry Diamond, who's a senior fellow at the Hoover Institute and at FSI. Oh, Larry's muted. Great.
I'm not muted on my end. Can you hear me now?
Oh. Yes, we can now. Thanks, Larry.
Well, thank you all. Let me begin by urging everyone to read Colin Call's superb co-authored piece in War on the Rocks this morning. I think it's one of the best and most comprehensive things I've read, speculating on the possible political implications of this pandemic. But I do want to say, well, I think Colin and Richard Haass are right that the pandemic will accelerate existing trends. We should be extremely cautious about making predictions about the political, social, and cultural impacts of the crisis. We just aren't very good, frankly, as social scientists at predicting the future. It's possible that the most damaging effects of the COVID-19 crisis will come from the devastating economic impacts. We know that economic depressions are very dangerous testing times for democracy and breeding grounds for racist and extremist movements. That's certainly been the history in previous depressions. But separate and apart from economic stress, we also know pandemics in the past have tended to foment fear, thus rumors, suspicion, all kinds of ethnocentric and xenophobic hostility. And that, of course, is an acceleration of an existing trend. The impact is going to be worse if the crisis unfolds in a way that further damages either general public trust in government or partisan political polarization. But that's not inevitable. It certainly hasn't been the trend in Taiwan or some other European countries. So a lot of this depends on political processing, and in particular, how the democracies manage the crisis and process the stress around it. I also think there's a potential to come out of this with renewed democratic prestige and momentum. But that's only going to be the case if the established democracies, the advanced liberal democracies, and most of all the US, become the world's what I'd call medical arsenal of the war on the pandemic, number one, manage the crisis both effectively and democratically within their borders, number two, and resume a more forward-leaning policy in defense of democratic norms and human rights. The crisis seems to be having 2 big and obvious negative effects on democracy. First of all, providing a compelling excuse for elected leaders with authoritarian ambitions to diminish democratic freedoms and checks and balances. And of course, all I have to do is mention Hungary there and people know what I'm talking about. But I'm very worried about Poland, India, Brazil, Mexico, a lot of other emerging democracies. And I'm worried about the United States. Second, the fact that the US and Europe are now the epicenter of the pandemic, while China seems to have largely recovered, although we don't know what will happen in the future, is fanning the narrative that the liberal West is over the hill and that the future lies with authoritarian regimes like China that know how to impose order and get things done. So I think the impact of COVID-19 crisis on global democracy will be heavily shaped by the following global perceptions and developments. And I'll put them in the form of 5 questions. How rapidly will the US and Europe get control of the pandemic and resume some degree of normal economic and societal life. Obviously, the longer it takes to control and recover, the greater is going to be the economic and geopolitical damage to democracies. And getting rapid control is going to require decisive federal government mobilization and leadership that elicits trust. And unfortunately, we need this at a time where I personally think we have the worst president of the United States in at least 160 years. Second, how will countries around the world come to perceive the relative efficacy and effectiveness of the advanced liberal democracies? And relative, I mean, in relation to major autocracies like China, Russia, the Gulf states, etc., some of the latter of which have been pretty effective. Russia, I think, is headed possibly for a very serious explosion of this crisis. We'll see. The third is, to what extent can the US and other liberal democracies use public diplomacy, strategic communications, traditional diplomacy, aid, and other instruments of geopolitics to counter these authoritarian narratives and disinformation and promote credible and truthful messaging about the superior capacity of democracies to fight the pandemic? We are way behind here, and China is running circles around us now in the war for global sympathy, control of the global narrative, and just the propagation of truthful information. Here we do have a lot to work with, I think, not yet so much in terms of the US management of the pandemic, but certainly in terms of how some other democracies, very notably in East Asia, Taiwan and Korea, have had success in containing the virus, through transparency, which is a unique trait of democracy, through effective state policies of testing, tracking, and quarantines, through strong public health institutions, and through broad societal trust and cooperation. Fourth question is, who will provide, coming back to my notion of a democratic arsenal, who will provide the critical supplies and assistance that will be needed to help lower income countries combat the pandemic? One reason why I think it is so critically important to invoke the Defense Production Act is not only for our own needs in the United States. There's going to be massive global needs as this crisis rolls forward in the months to come. And the question will be, can the US and its liberal democratic allies mass produce and globally distribute in a timely and effective fashion the desperately needed masks, other protective gear, and medical equipment and supplies? Who will win the race to develop a vaccine that can effectively end the global crisis and save national economies and millions of lives? And also, who might develop effective treatment medicines that can at least abate the seriousness of this? Finally, fifth question, how faithfully and effectively will the advanced liberal democracies, and again I stress most of all the United States, adhere to democratic norms and practices domestically while they grapple with the crisis? To the extent their elected executives and ruling parties eclipse civil liberties and use the crisis to enhance their power and degrade democratic norms and constraints, it's going to generate, I think, devastating demonstration effects. And I'll simply leave you with this point, echoing the urgently important work that our colleague Nate Persily has been doing. He is truly one of my heroes among our colleagues now, once you get past our public health colleagues, because he is doing so much to lead the effort to try and prepare states and fund states to develop the option of mail-in ballots. And if we do not have an election on November 3rd in the United States, in which citizens can freely and safely vote in the face of this pandemic, which will probably be going on still then or be renewing with ferocity then, we run the risk of first having a greatly depressed voter turnout that would gravely undermine the legitimacy and democraticness of the election. And I would just refer you to the experience of Wisconsin on Tuesday, and thus too burying the United States as a global model of democracy worthy of emulation. And there's no way we can bring this off without, at a minimum, a universal option for mail ballots. And as Nate has indicated in 2 of his recent public co-authored essays, that's got to mean a lot more funding for the states to assist them in making this transition.
Thank you so much, Larry. Next, we have Sherry Berman, Professor of Political Science at Barnard College, Columbia University.
Hi, thanks everybody for attending. I'd like to talk a little bit about sort of how this crisis has kind of revealed some of the sort of underlying strengths and weaknesses of different types of political regimes. So when the crisis started in China, much of the original narrative focused on how characteristics of the Chinese authoritarian regime had made this outbreak so much worse than it needed to be. The fact that information couldn't flow freely, the fact that local officials in Wuhan had an incentive not to report what was really going on, but rather to suppress a lot of the nasty details, the fact that the Chinese regime more generally so dependent on performance legitimacy also had a reason not to be transparent about the extent of the danger that the country was facing. And so that was the original narrative, and it was reinforced, I think, by the fact that one of the countries that soon followed China in having a major outbreak was Iran, where also infighting within the regime and some obvious problems with the sort of authoritarian nature of that government made the outbreak so much more, so much worse than it needed to be. But as the pandemic spread from China to other parts of the globe, one of the things that it really made clear was that within the category of democracy, there were wildly different responses to this crisis, widely different both in the sense of how effective they were and also in the sense of how the relationship between citizens and governments played out. So in theory, democracy should have a wide range of advantages in dealing with crises. Larry pointed to a couple of them. So democracies are supposed to have free flows of information. Governments and officials are supposed to be responsive to citizens' needs, and citizens are therefore supposed to trust them. Democracy should have resources that enable them to reach down deeply into society and deal with civil society actors, experts, and others who should be able to develop and coordinate effective responses to crises. But even in the abstract, those qualities of democracy, right, so obviously absent in China, what we realized very quickly was that, in fact, many countries that we call democracies really do not have these characteristics anymore. And so what the crisis revealed was how divergent the actual functioning of democracies has become, something we knew, but this made clear. So some democratic countries have taken advantage of these inherent strengths and dealt with the crisis very effectively and with minimal panic and divisiveness among their populations. Larry mentioned South Korea and Taiwan, but in Europe, there's been widely divergent responses too. The German government has been fairly successful, not only in responding to the actual health crisis, but in keeping citizens calm, in bringing people together. Same would be true of Scandinavian countries. Also, despite having actually quite different responses to the crises, there has been absolutely no sense that the government is acting in anything other than the public interest. A wide range of innovative policies have been decided on quite rapidly. Different political parties have come together to say they support the government. Citizens have responded with trust towards experts, towards government. And again, the key thing being, I think, that there has been a general consensus that it is the job of government to protect citizens, to deal with whatever the needs of the public are, and that there has been a sort of rally around the flag effect within many democratic countries. But on the opposite end of the spectrum, right, not only do we have places like Larry mentioned, like Hungary and elsewhere, Turkey, where we worry that leaders who call themselves democratic, but in fact were not, were using this crisis to further undermine whatever vestiges of democracy remained. More interesting is that countries that we still consider democratic, not marginal cases like Hungary and Turkey, actually have responded incredibly poorly to this crisis. That is to say, in ways that really reflect, and I fear will deepen, weaknesses. The United States is the most important example of this. We all know this story, right? When the crisis broke out, there were widely divergent views about the actual facts. Republicans in general did not believe that this was a crisis. There was widespread talk that, in fact, the whole idea of a pandemic was an idea that was made up by the Democrats to undermine Trump. The experts who said, look, we need to take measures and we need to take them fast, were basically ridiculed as part of a long-standing trend among Trump administration officials to kind of downplay the value of expertise. The government itself, the Trump administration, of course, had undermined much of the efficacy of important parts of the government. We know that many agencies have been understaffed, that much of the staffing that has occurred has often occurred on the basis of loyalty and partisanship rather than expertise. The administration waited way too long, partially for these reasons, but also because of a rhetoric that big government was bad, again, in comparison to other countries where it was absolutely accepted that in a time of crisis, it is the government's job to coordinate and deal with problems. This was something that we had to debate in the United States because for a very long time, one of our significant political parties had denied that government really should be at the forefront of dealing with any problems, much less crises. And so I think what the crisis has done is really revealed the incredible weaknesses within American democracy. It has highlighted them, and I fear that it will deepen them and make the sort of democratic quality of the United States diminish even further. Again, points that Larry has already made. But again, I think I would like to end on this kind of idea that crises have an incredible ability to kind of reveal the underlying strengths and weaknesses of different kinds of regimes. There's simply no doubt that the authoritarian nature of the Chinese regime made this crisis much worse, not just for Chinese citizens, but for the rest of the world. Precious weeks were lost while things were being covered up. But it's not just authoritarian regimes, right? Many regimes that we call democratic have allowed their inherent strengths to weaken or decay over the last years. And we've seen really, I think, during this pandemic, the tragic consequences of that.
Thank you so much, Sherry. We'll now move on to Frank Fukuyama, Senior Fellow at FSI, the Mosbacher Director of CDDRL, and the Director of the Ford Dorsey Masters in International Policy Program.
Okay, thank you, Dee Dee. So coming third, several of my points have been made by Larry and Sherry already. Let me start with one that Larry made. I've been asked by lots of journalists to speculate on the long-term impact, political impact of the crisis. I've not been giving very many interviews because I think it's just crazy to think that you're going to know what the world is going to look like in 9 months, not 2 years or 5 years, but 9 months from now, the world could look very different. I'm going to return to that subject at the end because I think that, the divergence in the good scenarios and the bad scenarios are much greater today than in normal circumstances. So to pick up on what Sherry was saying, I sort of think that there isn't going to be a strong correlation between whether you're democratic or authoritarian and how you did in this crisis. It's actually going to look a lot like the correlations between regime type and economic performance, where you get some really good democracies and some poor ones, and you get good autocracies and bad ones, except that the variance in the autocratic side usually is much larger. Some are spectacular performers and the bulk are very, very bad performers. And I imagine that that's going to happen. There's no generic weakness of democracies. All democracies have executive branches and they have the ability to exert executive authority. And that usually is called upon in emergencies like wars and pandemics. And every democracy has procedures that allow the government to massively strengthen itself. And that's true of the United States. I mean, the United States has a long tradition of anti-statism, we all know, but during the Civil War, during World War I, World War II, during the financial crisis in 2008, the government was able to massively mobilize resources, in fact, much more effectively than many authoritarian states. It's interesting, a lot of people don't know this, but for example, during World War I, Woodrow Wilson nationalized the entire railroad system. And so the Pennsylvania Railroad became a state-owned enterprise for a couple of years. During the 2008 financial crisis, the US Federal Reserve allocated hundreds of billions of dollars with zero congressional oversight to bail out different financial institutions simply on the discretionary authority of Ben Bernanke and the other board of governors of that institution. And that's a tremendous amount of discretionary authority to trust to anybody. So the question is really not, are democracies weaker? A good democracy takes that power back when the emergency ends. That's the real test. The United States demobilized after all of these big wars, even something like the Patriot Act, which was regarded as executive overreach, I think has been clawed back. And I'm reasonably confident that, whatever authorities we grant our executive in this crisis, when the thing eases, are not going to be kept. Now, that's not happening in Hungary. It's not happening in the Philippines. And that's obviously a really big issue. I think what does differentiate the performance of countries is really two things. So one is state capacity. And state capacity exists on very different levels. It's the frontline workers, the healthcare workers, the policemen, the firemen, the people that take care of driving ambulances, this sort of thing. Does the state have enough people to do this? Does it have the resources? Do they have the training? And it also depends on the quality of the upper reaches of the bureaucracy. But the second issue is really this question of social trust, and particularly trust in institutions and trust in government. And this is where, I really agree with Sherry that we've got a really big problem right now because, we came into this crisis as a highly polarized country. And in many ways, the polarization, rather than the crisis healing the polarization has undermined the response to the crisis because turns out, if you're a kind of red state governor or, a Trump supporter, you've been spending the last 2-3 months trying to deny that this was really a serious problem at all and raising suspicions about people that did consider it to be a serious problem. And so therefore, I think the fact that Scandinavia, Germany, the Netherlands, all of these democracies have maintained a much higher degree of political consensus and social trust within their political systems has given them a big edge in responding to the crisis. The same is true, I think, in Taiwan and other places in Asia, which are democratic, but nonetheless have, governments with strong capacity and then a lot of trust in that government on the part of citizens, which means that they obey, orders to stay inside much more thoroughly. They don't think that showing up at work, is an act of resistance against an unjust and illegitimate political authority and so forth. So let me just say something about the way that the world could look different and why I think it's just really stupid to speculate too much right now. I can imagine a couple of completely different worlds 9 months from now, all right? In one world, it's a continuation of many of the bad things that everybody is talking about. So obviously, pandemics and economic crises create hostility, resentment, nationalism, xenophobia, and all of these things, we can see them before our eyes deepening. But there's also specific ways in which it could get worse. And I think the most important empirical thing that will happen between now and then is whether countries that took early shutdown measures actually do demonstrably better than places in the world that dismissed the crisis and didn't take steps. So for example, if all the blue states in the United States, like California and New York, that acted fairly rapidly, managed to flatten the curve, and then all of a sudden in a few months, the red states like Florida that did not, or the states with red governors that did not take action, suddenly find themselves enmeshed in a huge crisis, or if Belarus or Brazil or other countries with leaders that said this is not important are really doing very badly, then that will, demonstrate, I think, the wisdom of experts, but it could turn out the opposite. And actually here, I think Sweden and Japan are countries to watch because they've had relatively relaxed responses. And if they are not punished for that, and if other countries that had relaxed responses are not punished, then you will get an acceleration of this shift towards populism and a discrediting of expertise. It's going to do a lot for Trump if, the country gets through it, and the red states, that didn't shut down are doing just fine. And then, the things that flow from that, I don't have to spell out. On the other hand, you could have a completely opposite reaction, which I would label the 1932 scenario. So the Great Depression started with the stock market crash in 1929. The Republicans kept pushing policies like tight money and fiscal austerity for several years into the crisis. And it took the banking crisis in 1931 to suddenly make everybody sit up and realize this is nonsense. These policies are digging us in deeper. And that's what led to the Democratic takeover during the 1932 election. And then basically 70 more years of Democratic hegemony in the United States. And that's also a possible outcome of this, right? So this is why I say you got two very, very different possibilities. And then the third one is right in the middle, where, we're polarized already, and essentially the crisis simply, because we're living in parallel information universes, red and blue interpret the crisis according to their ideological priors, and rather than coming to any kind of consensus, we are deepened in our suspicions of each other and, in the set of policies that we went into the crisis with. So that's why I'm not going to tell you what I think is likely as an outcome, because I really think we could be living in any one of these worlds. And we will probably know this in 9 months. Thank you.
Thanks, Frank. All right, and finally, but not least, we have Steve Stedman, Senior Fellow at FSI and Professor of Political Science by courtesy at Stanford.
Great, thanks, Dee Dee. Now the pandemic, the economic crisis, the humanitarian fallout are all going to require a global response. So the question is, how are we doing, and what are the prospects of effective international action to get us out of this mess? It's easy to complicate the prerequisites for international cooperation, but one of my bosses from my UN days, Gro Brundtland, put it most bluntly: you get international cooperation when governments choose to cooperate. And so right now, despite an abundance of need for concerted global action on multiple fronts, it's worth asking the question, are governments choosing to cooperate? And the answer, with a few important exceptions, is no. Even before the pandemic, international cooperation had declined precipitously in such diverse issue areas as security, arms control and proliferation, trade, refugee protection, and other areas. Now I start here because it matters greatly for whether international institutions can be effective. When major powers share a basic interest in rules of the road and understanding that cooperative solutions are superior to self-help, institutions and regimes can solidify common expectations, rules, and focal points. When major powers don't share such an interest, international institutions still have an important role, but in terms of effectiveness, there's clearly, it's much more difficult for them to be effective. But the important role is that they still have to provide information that can help major powers implement cooperative solutions if they decide that those solutions are in their interest. So let me jump to the pandemic. Now, I think one thing that has to happen at the end of the pandemic is that every democratic government is going to have a postmortem about how their country actually did and how they responded. And then there has to be a very close examination of the World Health Organization and its performance. Three issues suggest that a deeper dive is going to be really in order in terms of the World Health Organization. The first question is, why was the WHO so deferential to China about the accuracy and transparency of their data on the outbreak, especially in the early stages of the disease? Second, given that there was sufficient reason to doubt the early accuracy of Chinese reports, and given China's decision to first deal with the pandemic through obfuscation and denial of access, why did the WHO on January 8th advise unconditionally, quote, against the application of any travel or trade restrictions on China based on the information currently available? And why did it publicly declare on January 14th, quote, that preliminary investigations by the Chinese authorities have found no clear evidence of human-to-human transmission of the novel coronavirus? Third, why was the WHO slow in declaring a public health emergency? They didn't declare one until January 30th. Now, the obvious answer is that the leadership of the WHO decided that given the state of geopolitics in the world, it was better to tread extremely softly with Chinese authorities in the belief that it would get better results than a policy of chastisement. This is, by the way, the same approach that some very good scientists have chosen with Donald Trump. But here the comparison is really fruitful, I think. Somehow over the last couple of months, Anthony Fauci, for instance, has maintained his credibility and dignity, in part because through all of this, he's been a straight shooter. Even when he has to contradict Donald Trump, which is very difficult, but he's been a straight shooter. He's kept his credibility. I think WHO failed on this test. It lost its credibility because it let its soft approach to China corrupt its ability to inform others of what it believed was actually happening on the ground. It chose to give credibility to the Chinese when what Chinese authorities were reporting was evidently not credible. So from my couple of years at the UN and 30 years of observing international institutions, I have one abiding conclusion, which is that they can only be effective when they tell member states what they need to know, not what they want to hear. And on this standard, WHO failed, and its relevance during the crisis has been weakened. It's not surprising at all to see governments choose self-help and national solutions, despite it being a transnational problem. Second, when we turn away from health and turn towards the question of developing countries and the potential humanitarian fallout, I think we have a huge problem here. Paul Wise in last week's webinar explained why stay-at-home orders and societal lockdowns may be inappropriate for poor countries and might actually lead to worse health, societal, and political outcomes. Paul's message is echoed by a very good blog post by Norman Loaiza, the lead research economist at the World Bank. As Loaiza points out, when lockdowns are imposed in megacities or large peri-urban neighborhoods, the result can be social compression, not social distancing. Massive displacement from urban to rural areas spread contagion rather than contain it. Lockdowns most hurt economically those already at the margin, causing mass unemployment in countries that lack safety nets. Those who survive through the informal economy are hit the hardest. Domestic violence can become rampant, and they become convenient tools for dictators or would-be dictators to crush opposition, human rights, and civil liberties. So when you combine those reasons with what Paul was saying about legitimacy and trust being necessary for lockdowns to actually work, many of the countries of the global south lack both, and you can easily see an incendiary spiral of ungovernability, contagion, economic destitution, and massive food insecurity. So this is a huge space to watch, and the actions needed to prevent humanitarian catastrophe span health, international monetary policies, trade, especially in the food markets, economic aid, and governance. There's no one international institution that can do this, which is why international leadership becomes so important, and the US is AWOL. The G20 could be a focal point for interconnected action. We haven't seen much action out of it. The United States Security Council has been AWOL. It met yesterday and it released one of the blandest statements in its history. Finally, a word about international economic cooperation. In my mind, there are two American policymakers who've done an outstanding job in trying to curtail the damage of this crisis. Not surprisingly, one is Fauci. The other is Jerome Powell, who has been innovative, fast, and has greatly extended the Fed's reach and mandate. Because of Powell, we are truly in a strange world where despite everything that the Trump and the Trump administration has done to denigrate international cooperation and economics, the United States has been robust in ensuring that it is still the world's lender of last report, and it's actively stabilizing financial markets the world over, while at the same time, Trump's hostility to the WTO and international trade in particular keeps tariffs in place at a time when they make the provision of needed medical supplies harder to access, create enormous barriers to trade in major food stocks, which can undermine global food security, and will likely cripple efforts to restart the world economy. So this is where we are. We desperately need international leadership because it's not one crisis, it's three crises. As I said, the United States is AWOL.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for those remarks, dispiriting as some of them may be. We have a lot of good questions. I'll go ahead and pose a few that have come up from the Q&A, and I'll turn to the panelists in turn to answer whichever ones you feel equipped to. The first are questions about privacy and security in democracies in particular. There's a question from Clay Bullwinkle. What do you think of centrally administered and perhaps enforced apps for social distancing and enforced testing and quarantining? And also a similar question from Aubin Nizau about whether or not tracing people or potentially having to do things we might consider invasions of privacy are necessary and tractable for liberal societies. So the second question comes from Jennifer Chu. Are there any thoughts from our panelists about the impact of historic levels of economic inequality in the United States and around the globe with respect to how the world might look after the pandemic? And finally, how do you recommend handling public, from Eileen Donahoe, how do you recommend handling public diplomacy and the public narrative around China's responsibility for the spread of the disease around the world? For example, calls for China to be held legally liable for the crisis. And Larry, we'll start with you. We'll just go in order.
Okay, briefly, the more robust and mandatory testing and tracing that was an important part of the first set of questions are what Korea and Taiwan have done. And I think, you know, if you have public health institutions that are effective, if you have some degree of government trust, it helped enormously, let's be honest, in these democracies and Singapore, that they had been through the SARS crisis and Korea through the MERS crisis. Korea was the hardest hit country for MERS outside of the Middle East. And so they had learned, the governments and the public, about the need for rapid measures. But I think these countries' experience suggests that you can get the public to accept a lot if there's transparency and effectiveness and a clear intention to lift all this, sunset it once the crisis is over. Briefly on the public diplomacy, I don't favor China bashing. I really don't. We just don't have the time to play that game. I do think that if China's going to accuse us of having invented the virus and inflicted it on China and the world, we should vigorously remind people where and how the virus got started. But I don't want to demonize China. I just want to make it the responsible stakeholder that we thought it was going to become in the early 2000s.
Right, Sherry?
So I mean, as far as the privacy question goes, I mean, I think this gets back to a lot of the points that the other panelists made, right? I mean, it is clear that in order to truly effectively deal with the public health challenges, we need to test people, we need to track them, we need to some degree make compromises with privacy that we might normally not be comfortable with. But the key is, right, is your society trusting enough? Are opposition parties willing to work together so that, again, as Larry said, some of these things are not only sunsetted, we're sure that they're not going to go on any longer than is necessary, but that the oversight is there to make sure that what is done is what is necessary to deal with the public health challenge and no more. It is very hard to get that kind of oversight. It is very hard to get that kind of agreement on policies if polarization is extremely high and citizens don't trust each other or their government. So again, you know, yes, compromises need to be made. The question is not just about the capacity of our public health services, but about the capacities that our states have, and the relationship between those states and societies, I think, is really crucial in determining what can be done and what the implications of those policies are for privacy and other concerns going forward. As far as the inequality question is concerned, I think this is a really crucial one. I mean, it was already brought out that the way this pandemic is going to hit poor countries is going to be very different from the way it's going to hit rich ones. But even within wealthy countries, we can already see that, socioeconomic differences have played a huge role in determining which people and which communities are suffering more or less. People who are crowded together in big cities, just like they are in poorer countries, people who have disproportionately high levels of pre-existing conditions, diabetes, asthma, health, heart issues. These are all communities that are poor, have these kinds of pre-existing conditions more than those who are wealthy. Can you afford to escape to your summer home? This is a big issue in New York, right? If you look at the number of cases in a place like New York, where I am, the number of cases in poor neighborhoods, even within the city, is much higher than it is in the wealthier areas. So we can already see, as I said before, how this crisis is reflecting and deepening a lot of the problems and cleavages that are already within our societies. Now, I assume that actually maybe one of the questioners was thinking of, I believe, the fellow Walter Scheidel, who's written a book about pandemics and inequality. I think he might actually be a historian at Stanford, although I may be misremembering that at the spur of the moment. And, so there are people who say that crises like these do have a leveling effect, potentially have a leveling effect. And that's sort of what the historical record shows. I mean, he's an expert on this and he's written about it. It very much also, though, depends, right? And I think what we're going to see is, whether we are made aware, as we were, for instance, in the Second World War, that we are all in it together, right? That it's very hard for some parts of society to be healthy while others are not. And that things that we've been fighting about, access to basic health care, support for people when they lose their jobs, whether we come out of this with a renewed appreciation for the need for those kinds of things, or whether we fall back into the sort of partisan bickering and polarization and demonization of people suffering that we had before. Again, like my fellow panelists, I don't know how this is going to play out, but I think we can see, again, that the crisis has revealed and highlighted the inequalities within our societies, whether going forward it will have a positive effect or simply continue the differentiation within our societies of so many outcomes based on levels of inequality. It's very hard to say. A lot, of course, will depend on the election in November, whether we have it and who wins it.
Okay, Frank?
Yeah, I don't see the government shifting to mandatory enforcement of either quarantines or basically violations of privacy. If this were smallpox or plague or something far more lethal than COVID seems to be, then I think that issue would come up. But for the time being, I don't worry about that. The thing that I worry about actually is the following. I've been running this antitrust working group looking at the impact of scale in the internet platforms and the IT industry in general. The people that are going to come out the big winners from this are those companies, right? It's those gigantic Googles and Facebooks and Apples and so forth, for a couple of reasons. First of all, it turns out that the internet backbone is, we couldn't be here. We wouldn't be here doing this panel if it weren't for the internet backbone and the companies that provide those services. And they've been very reliable and really have kept a lot of the economy going. But the other thing is that the people that are being wiped out now are small, medium, and family enterprises, right? All these big companies have cushions of hundreds of billions of dollars. They're going to survive this thing fine. What's going to get wiped out are all the small companies. And I think that it's just going to reinforce this trend that we've seen over the last 20 years towards increasing concentrations of economic power, right? On the inequality thing, yeah, I think if we lived in a rational world, this pandemic would show that it's totally crazy for the United States not to have a universal health care system or some kind of mandate that gets everybody health insurance. I mean, frankly, it was crazy for us not to have this before the crisis, but it certainly underlines that. But that's completely different from saying whether the political system will say, oh yeah, that is irrational, and then do something about it, or not. And I think that's why these two different scenarios I posed. I could imagine a scenario where you actually still get a reinforcement of these conservative views that, again, blocks us from really acting on what I think is a pretty obvious need.
Okay, Steve?
Yeah, just briefly on the China part. I agree with Larry. It's not a time for China bashing. And yeah, there is a public diplomacy battle to be fought over dealing with outrageous lies, rumors, conspiracies about where this thing came from and America's role in it, et cetera. But the fact of the matter is, on the dimensions that I described in dealing with this sort of triple crisis of disease, economics, and humanitarian crisis, the United States and China are going to have to reach agreement on some pretty fundamental points. And so I would rather see our efforts actually going into dealing with the crises than dealing with public diplomacy as to who has done what, where, when, how, right?
Right. We have time for a few more questions. One from Tom Finger. There's no question that the US national government has performed poorly, but federalism has allowed some states to perform okay. So how do unitary and central governments, how have they functioned differently in this time? And he has a second great question, which is, can you distinguish between performance of systems and processes versus failures of leadership? To what extent are we sort of aligning those things? And the second question from Mike McFall about the lessons of Wisconsin for American elections. What are the prospects for holding a free, fair, and legitimate election and having to scramble to do so by November? What are some minimal remedies versus maximal solutions? And there was an earlier question from Mary Steiner about what civil society organizations can do in a context like this. Larry, we'll start with you.
Well, I'll make 2 points. First of all, what I wanted to make before, this is not a partisan comment about our current national leadership. I would just ask everyone to do this mental experiment. Imagine that in very early January, when the intelligence reports began to come in about the scope of the public health emergency that was developing in China, that the President of the United States had been any one of the following 4 individuals: John McCain, Mitt Romney, Barack Obama, or Hillary Clinton. What do you think the response of the United States would have been? Imagine that any of those 4 individuals had been inaugurated president on January 20th. Do you think they would have dismantled the unit within the National Security Council in charge of mobilizing the country for and monitoring pandemics? So I don't think it's just about state capacity. I think state capacity would have been dramatically different if we had different political leadership in the United States. With respect to November, I'll just say it again. There is no variable that worries me about the future of American democracy more than the ability of the United States to conduct an election on November 3rd that will be broadly viewed as legitimate. And if we have in the United States of America a replay of what happened in Wisconsin on Tuesday, where large numbers of urban residents, disproportionately racial minorities, are either unable to vote or have to risk their lives to vote, standing in hideously and needlessly long lines because the number of polling stations has been reduced by about 90 to 95% because of the crisis. And we don't have vote by mail options to enable people safely to vote. And the outcome of the election, or the inclusiveness of the election, is distorted as a result of that. I think one will have to question whether we will have had a democratic election in the United States at that point. And I think the legitimacy and stability of American democracy, including the ability to avoid violence, will be gravely, gravely threatened. And I'll just say, I'm involved in a public opinion project where we're going to be releasing results in a few weeks, where we have posed scenarios about people's willingness to embrace violence if they think the election outcome was illegitimate. And these questions were asked in November before the COVID-19 pandemic broke. And the results are pretty disturbing. If they were disturbing beforehand, imagine Wisconsin writ large in November in 10 or 15 swing states.
Sherry?
Well, I would like to unfortunately echo Larry's rather grim prognosis about the consequences of a, a problematic election in November. I think that's something that all of us as citizens have to think very carefully about and do whatever we can to support those forces that are trying to put in place provisions so that if this pandemic has not significantly alleviated and we can't hold an election normally, that we have other options available. Two other questions. One person asked about civil society. Look, an active civil society is a great strength of democracy, but I would say that in crises, right, you realize once again that without a legitimate, strong government, problems cannot be solved. All of the great civil society organizations we have in this country cannot alone, all of the vibrant private businesses, the Googles and whatever, without a strong, effective government, major public challenges will not be solved. I think that is a problem that Americans have a lot of trouble seeing simply because our private sector is so vibrant and our civil society is so active. When real problems hit, when collective action dilemmas need to be overcome, you either have a strong and active government or you don't, and problems will get solved or they won't. And I think this crisis simply makes that point particularly sharp. And this gets to the question, I think, of leadership as well. Look, in normal times, when you're not facing crises, governments kind of act a little bit, sort of on the basis of inertia, government agencies, bureaucracies, blah, 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 blah. Putting aside the question of how much the Trump administration has undermined the capacity of some of those things, I think in times of crises, it's very hard to separate leadership from governance issues, precisely for the reasons I said before. You need strong, decisive action. If the person at the top of the pyramid during a crisis is dithering, is not taking things seriously, in fact, is denying that a crisis exists, it is very hard to have fast, effective responses to problems. In normal times, you can kind of get away with it a little bit because, again, the sort of standard operating procedures can deal with the challenges at hand. When you have a new challenge that has to be dealt with quickly, if you do not have strong leadership, then you really are at a huge disadvantage, I would say.
Frank?
Yeah, well, Sherry just made the point I would have made. I mean, it's not, you have to have both the structure of rules and you have to have discretionary authority. And no government can get away without delegating a certain amount of discretionary authority, and the amount goes up when you have a crisis. And therefore, there's really no optimal form of government, because then it just becomes a question of who happens to be in the driver's seat at that time. In Mexico and Brazil, which are reasonable, middle-income democracies, you just happen to have people at the top that, have really wacky opinions about this, this crisis, and they made very bad decisions, and that, that's what comes with that kind of delegation of authority.
Steve?
Yeah. So to Tom's question, is this leadership failure, is a system failure? One way of thinking about it that I've been thinking about a lot is Amartya Sen's argument about famines. The argument, democracies don't suffer famine. Famines are man-made, and democracies don't suffer them essentially because of information and a free press. Authoritarian countries suffer from information control problems, and bad information doesn't get up to the top because nobody wants to deliver bad information to the leadership, et cetera. There's all kinds of incentives to suppress bad information, right? That makes the regime look bad. And what we saw unfold was exactly right in the case of China, is that for the first, certainly for the first 6 weeks, that's exactly how it played out. The communist system did not want to deal with bad information, right? It wasn't getting out of Wuhan, right? It's like it wasn't getting to she didn't want to listen to, it's like it was all information that downplayed the seriousness of what was happening. And yet, in the United States, you see the same thing with Trump. And so I think in this day and age, we need to be rethinking, again, it's what Frank said is exactly right, rethinking the categories of democracy and authoritarianism, where you have populist democracy and you have a leader like Trump who does not want to hear bad news. Everything he wants to hear is praise. Everything is great. He has done the greatest job of all times, right? And he puts sycophants into positions of authority right, who don't want to tell him bad news, you're going to get the exact kind of result that you saw here, which is just an abysmal response to not famine, but to a pandemic, right? But it's the same kind of informational problem, but it's one centered on the leader, not on the system.
Well, thank you so much. I think that that's all we have time for, but I really appreciate everyone's incredible insights today. They were really helpful. And Mike, did you want to say any final words? Thank you to our questioners and our listeners as well, of course.
I'm not, can you hear me? Oh, there I am. Yeah, just thank you all. That was fantastic. It was depressing, of course, but I think also a reminder of why we need people like you thinking about these problems right now. And so I'm extremely grateful for what you gave me to think about, and hope everybody will tune in next week for the next session on international security matters. Thank you all again, and especially Sherry for joining us today. That was great.
Thanks, Sherry.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.